Hey,
Hello.
we have Holly Black back again.
Yay!
And I figured last episode, I had a Fantasy Quorum some questions. I have so many questions for the Fantasy Quorum that I'm going to start asking us questions and see what we think. All right? So we're going to start with one that's a little similar to last time. Is Beowulf fantasy?
Is Beowulf fantasy?
Is Beowulf fantasy?
What is the argument against Beowulf being fantasy?
That the Beowulf poet, we don't know who they were, thought that this was a historical account. If you think you're writing a historical account and you do not know that these fantastical things don't exist, and I'm specifically picking Beowulf instead of a religious text for that reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That you don't know, you think Grendel was a real, actual threat. Is that a fantasy story or not?
I don't know if I agree with the premise that the writer thought it was true.
Okay.
But
let's assume that they did.
Assume that they did,
right?
Okay.
It's a little like we know so little about the Beowulf author, like that it's hard to say either way, but we can assume, like we know that like with like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they probably knew that a lot of what they're saying they were just making up. But the Beowulf author, we don't know. And there are indications that indicate that this was like they were writing down a story that they'd heard from family members and they were making it poetic and stuff. I'm like, I'm going to get this down. But let's assume.
Okay.
Beowulf author thinks they are writing history.
Mm-hmm. There
are dragons and Grendels and, you know, a guy swimming across the ocean. Probably he could actually have done that, but who knows?
This is feeling more like let's define a genre,
right?
Than it is about is this thing part of the genre?
Is this fantasy? Yeah, like is it fantasy? If you wrote it thinking it wasn't.
All right, I have two things to say about this. Both of them sideways.
Okay.
I mean, one being, you know, we often define genre by what sits in genre in bookstores, right?
Yes.
And this would sit outside of it.
That's a great argument.
But my second point is that I see this like most commonly actually with ghost stories in contemporary literature because most people believe in ghosts.
They do.
And so ghosts occur in literary fiction all the time without being considered fantasy at all. And they'll show up in ways that like I'm not expecting and where I'm thinking this isn't a fantasy and they are treated like it's not fantasy.
Yeah. See, good point. Very good point.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that Beowulf is not fantasy. Assuming that the author didn't think it was. I think Midsummer Night's Dream is fantasy. I don't know about Beowulf, right? They're not Beowulf. I don't know about Hamlet. Like, does he think he's writing historical fiction rather than a fantasy story by including a ghost? Because he thinks that a ghost coming and saying these things could be real.
Yeah. I think that if we take the premise, which again, this is me making something up, that fantasy is a modern construction and that for most of history we have assumed that all of this supernatural stuff is real and exists, and it's only today that we're so smart and we think we're smarter than everyone else and that none of this stuff is true, that all kinds of things, such as Shakespeare, we can look back and go, oh, well, clearly this is fantasy. I don't know if I'm making my point well, but my point that we have a very different sense of genre. Fantasy today than anyone has ever had before.
Yeah, it's a good point.
To your point, I do think it's fantasy because I would recommend it to somebody who wanted fantasy, which maybe has changed my definition of fantasy for a previous.
I mean, one of the great inspirations for Tolkien was Beowulf. So, all right, I'll take us off this one. Question number 2 for the Fantasy Quorum.
Okay.
What is the second best fantasy film of all time?
The second best fantasy film of all time.
Being that the first best is
Lord of the Rings.
Oh, we're counting them together.
Yes, I'll count them together. You can dispute me on that. I said that specifically anyway. But I would say the Lord of the Rings trilogy is our number 1.
Okay.
And we can split this. What's number 2? epic fantasy. You can also dispute my number one because if you want it like secondary world-esque fantasy, like I would say Spiderwick counts, but like I'm not compelled to say Ratatouille. As a
I see.
right?
Yeah, right.
Like overtly presented as a fantasy film, as opposed to something that is a whimsical but not and fantastical, right? So you can take it either way. What's number two? What's your number two fantasy film?
Maybe Pan's Labyrinth.
Okay.
Pan's Labyrinth is a good choice.
A really good choice.
I'm gonna say Groundhog Day.
Okay, that's in the Ratatouille realm. I'm shoving that into Ratatouille realm.
That's the Ratatouille
I thought
realm.
the Ratatouille realm was animated. That's where I was saying.
I'm shoving this is presented to the world with fantasy tropes and as a fantasy film, not as a something weird happened.
Okay, so it's something weird happened doesn't count.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not going to let you pick Groundhog Day because Groundhog Day is awesome and it definitely would be, but fantasy.
Okay.
Right?
The Dark Crystal.
Oh, that's your number two, huh?
I might have to choose the Dark Crystal.
That's your number two. Okay. What am I going to pick? I asked this question and hadn't even really considered it. It's not Dark Crystal. I like Dark Crystal, but I've watched it again as an adult, and I'm like, ugh. The puppetry is amazing. The world building's amazing. I'm not sure if this story hangs together. And
That's fair.
And even legitimately works, right? By my own rules, can we count? Let's see. I don't think we can count like Aladdin and like some of those Disney films. So like straight up presented as epic fantasy. Man. That puts
Flight of Dragons with
Flight of
soundtrack
Dragons.
by John Denver.
It's not Flight of Dragons for me. It's not Dragonheart, though I like Dragonheart. How to Train Your Dragon.
How to Train Your
How
Dragon.
to Train Your Dragon. Presented as a fantasy film, right?
Okay.
Secondary world.
I would put that over Shrek and a lot of the other kind of fantasy films. I'm going to go How to Train Your Dragon. That's my number two.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good.
Worst fantasy film that, in your opinion, is worst that other people love.
Well, I can't say Ratatouille because it has its own realm.
I'll let you say Ratatouille this time. It has its own episode.
No, I don't.
Are there?
Ratatouille
It doesn't
that
have to be
much.
worse, but are there ones that you're like, I just don't get this. I just don't. It doesn't click with me.
Go ahead.
I was going to go the other way.
Oh,
Here's
really?
the one that I stand
Yeah.
behind.
You go ahead. That's
Legend.
perfect. Legend.
Tom
Legend
Cruise's
is
finest
good.
film.
Legend is really good.
I love Legend.
That is a good choice.
I know many people
But Legend.
have things to say that are not as positive, but I stand behind Legend.
Do you prefer original soundtrack or new soundtrack? Do you know
Original
there's two?
soundtrack.
Okay, because original's like Tangerine
Tangerine
Dream.
Dream.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. They did a re-release
Yeah,
with
no,
an orchestral.
you can't do.
Not allowed.
No.
Okay. Okay.
I have Tangerine Dream albums
I
because
do
of
too.
this.
For the same reason.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Legend. It's only kind of okay until Tim Curry shows up. But he's romancing a 14-year-old or whatever, right? It's so creepy.
Well, yeah,
she
but
is definitely not an
he's
adult.
The devil. It is supposed to be creepy.
Yeah, I know it's supposed to be creepy, but I really want to like Tim Curry even when he's the devil. And I'm like, there's a creepiness level to, I'm the devil and I've cast Bill and Ted into hell. And I'm the devil, 14-year-old.
I'm going to hit on him. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I like the devil.
Yeah.
This is too far, devil.
I think I have an issue with media that uses the devil and doesn't allow him to be evil. Like, as much as I really dug Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, for example, they kept stepping back from the ledge.
Okay.
And they had actual Satan, the devil, as a character, getting her to do things. And then he'd say, oh, you don't actually have to go through with this. I'm not going to actually make you harm this person.
Okay.
And I'm like, the real devil would. Come on. Let's just let him be evil.
Is darkness the devil? A devil?
Right. And I'm going to kind of dispute here just a little bit. Like, it depends on, right? Like, how evil is your devil? Right? Like, is your devil I play chess with God now and then, and we sit and chat about, the necessity of there being a competition and things like this? Or is your devil I inspire mass murderers devil and things like that? Have you seen, we've talked about it, haven't we? We can't even really talk about what it is. The best appearance by The Rock on Saturday Night Live ever.
Oh, yes.
We talked about that on the podcast.
The mad scientist
There's
competition.
a mad scientist competition. Do you know this, Holly Black? There's a mad scientist competition. And the sketch is it's Invention of the Year award.
And it is specifically evil inventions.
Evil inventions.
Evil scientists.
Yes, the evil League of Evil Scientists. And one gets up and is like, oh, I have a freeze ray. And they're like, oh, so evil. And another's like, I made this thing to teleport the moon away. So evil. And then The Rock shows up playing a nerd. And he's like, well, and then he proceeds to explain a device which does something genuinely horrific that is so horrific that I can't say it on the podcast. But they somehow got it past the censors. And the entire room of mad scientists is like, and they lean away and they're like, ew. And he's like, well, I mean, I don't think the rest of you understood the assignment, did you? I mean, what's evil? Freezing someone or bleep? And they're all like, get out of here, right? Like, is your devil, would he fit in that room with the rest of those people? Because a lot of them do.
A lot
in media.
Well, that is a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I always appreciated about the Lucifer comics
was
that you would, like Mike Carey would write him, where you would become very sympathetic. And you would think, oh, yeah, no, he is the hero of these comics. And then he would do something so horrific that you would remember what you were reading. And it was such a good trick. And he did it over and over again over the course of that
every
series.
Time.
Yeah.
Holly, what was your first fantasy book that you read? What was the one that kind of, or like your foundation myth fantasy? It doesn't have to be the very first, but you know what I mean?
Right. I mean, probably the Lloyd Alexander books.
Okay.
The Book of Three and those. I recently read them to my son, and it was really fun how much they actually really hold up. And they're great.
See, and I missed those.
Really?
Because I didn't start reading until I was a teenager. And those were already a little too young for me. I started on Barbara Hamley. And Anne McCaffrey. And so I missed a bunch of those, like they called them juveniles back then before we had YA. I missed a bunch of those that I just never read.
I missed Dark is Rising. I read it later.
I missed those.
Yeah, I didn't read those. I'm trying to think of what I read before McCaffrey. And Lloyd Alexander is what comes to mind. And the one that I've talked about before, and I can never remember what it is, that has a girl pretending to be a guy so she can join the king's army. It's great
Not
fantasy.
The Blue Sword.
Yes.
Oh, Lana.
Tamora Pierce.
Tamora
Pierce.
Yeah.
Yeah, read that in 5th grade, a year before I got to McCaffrey. So,
all right, next question. This is actually one that I've been waiting to ask.
Wait.
Oh.
Because you asked of, what's the fantasy that doesn't click, and I have a controversial answer.
Go for it.
And I know this is a controversial answer, but The Last Unicorn for me doesn't work. And I have no problem with it. It's not like Ratatouille where everyone else is wrong and I'm right. It's a good movie that missed me somehow.
Okay.
And now she doesn't even want to sit next to me.
Horrifying.
I know.
Have you read the book?
I haven't read the book.
Book is delightful. His use of language
and I've
is so
met
beautiful.
him, and he's wonderful, which is why I even hesitate to say, a lot of it, we're talking about, you asked about the fantasy movies, and I mentioned the two that we had on VHS that I watched endlessly growing up. Last Unicorn is not one that we had on VHS, and I didn't watch it endlessly growing up, and so I don't have that connection to it.
Yeah. For me, it actually might be a book rather than a film, because I wish people would just let Terry Brooks keep writing weird stuff instead of making him write more Shannara books, because his weird stuff so much better than the Shannara sequels.
I read every single Magic Kingdom for Sale book.
I read those too.
Yeah. The instant they were published, and I would go and grab it. Whereas the Shannara ones,
I read those though too.
yeah, I mean, I read them.
I cried when Alanin died.
Yeah, yeah. But I really like the original Shannara trilogy, and like everybody, I feel the second is the strongest. But then I went and I read Landover, and like years later, there was Running with the Demon and stuff like this, and he was really doing interesting stuff. And then I'd come back to Shannara, and I'd be like, I've outgrown this, but his other stuff would be still cool and evocative to me, and so. All right, here's my question for you.
Okay.
As a quorum representing fantasy, should we hold a court and put on trial all of these people who pretend to write a fantasy book and they pretend it's science fiction? Mr. Terry Brooks, Mr. Robert Jordan, Miss Anne McCaffrey. So if you don't know what happens, a lot of people like to write a fantasy book, but then a few years later they say, that fantasy book was secretly a science fiction book all along. Ha ha. And I think that's cheating. And I think they should be held accountable for their cheatiness.
I think that our labels are needlessly restrictive in the first place, and separating fantasy and science fiction does some good, but also we can take it too far.
Well, that'll be our next conversation. But for right now, should we have them on trial? Look, they all did it. I'm reading in the 80s, right? And they still kind of do it. Like you might be like, Brandon, didn't you turn your worlds into science fiction? Yes, but I got there naturally. I didn't say, secretly all along, The Wheel of Time was a science fiction story. Though, let's say it was really cool when I read The Wheel of Time and I found out the Mercedes symbol and things like that, where it's a post-apocalypse. But when Terry Brooks did, I'm like, come on, Shannara's a post-apocalypse. So anyway, I think we should have trial.
See, that's one of my favorite things, though. Like, I am a huge fan of Fred Saberhagen.
Yes.
And when I realized what he was doing with Empire of the East, that was a post-apocalypse, it blew my mind.
The Books of Swords are all science fictions masquerading as fantasies.
I think to echo the Grendel question, I feel like if you believe you are writing science fiction all along, and I believe that Anna McCaffrey believed she was writing science fiction, that you cannot be put on trial.
I think you can be put on trial for being sneaky. You put cool Michael Whalen dragons on your covers, and then you told us we were reading science fiction all along. You were sneaky, Anne.
We will all be put on trial if we're getting put on trial for sneakiness.
Oh, yeah, we deserve it. We absolutely deserve it. There's no reason we shouldn't be put on trial. But I'm just saying, Anne, that's a fantasy book.
That's fantasy.
That's a fantasy book. It got dragons.
I believe that she would fight you.
Yeah, she totally would. Yeah, Todd would run by and smack me and cover me in Todd dust. That's a real thing. He throws glitter at people.
So, have I told you that I did the opposite of this with Partials?
Okay.
Partials is post-apocalyptic science fiction. It is my fantasy series disguised as post-apocalyptic science fiction. I consider it fantasy, especially by the third book. It's so obvious.
Okay. Here's another one. You got my brain. The Prestige won the World Fantasy Award as a book. They did not win the Science Fiction Award, the World Fantasy book. Should The Prestige have won the World Fantasy Award? Do you guys know The Prestige?
I do know The Prestige.
You've seen the movie? If you've seen the movie accurately represents the book in a way that's kind of brilliant because the book is almost unfilmable, but they still found a way to do it. But it is basically the same narrative. Is The Prestige a fantasy film?
Why would it not be?
Because it's a science fiction film about teleportation.
Teleportation and cloning.
Yes.
I believe it is. I believe it is numinous enough to be fantasy.
I am voted down.
How does it work?
How does it work?
How does it work?
It works with science.
Yeah, definitely. It works
Nikola
with science.
Tesla is in there.
Nikola Tesla.
Sciencing
Science
things.
it.
Yeah.
So that Hugh Jackman gets teleported, but cloned as he's teleported.
I suppose I am willing to accept the idea of numinous science fiction.
Otherwise, we have to kick Star Trek out the door into the
Yeah,
face.
I mean, but I'm not sure I'm willing to accept that cloning is only science.
Okay. Yeah. But Nikola Tesla used magic electricity. So I suppose, because he did things with technology, so there's an argument there. By the way, I'm not saying that the Prestige book shouldn't have won. It is a fantastic novel that you should all read if you haven't read it. Even if you've watched the movie, I think you'll appreciate the book in a different way. So it's absolutely a masterpiece, but also it won the World Fantasy Award, and I'm still a little salty about that, if you can't tell. The Hugos almost exclusively go to science fiction books, so do the Nebulas. They're named after a science fiction editor and after a nebula. So the World Fantasy, I feel like, maybe should err on things that stray a little bit more into the fantasy realm, and they stealth give it to science fiction books now and then. You know. I say they. It's a juried award with a rotating jury, so it's not like there's any one cabal. So
I remember being at the Nebulas at one point at the convention.
Yeah.
And a gentleman stood up and asked a panel. I do not remember what the panel was supposed to be talking about. And he said, "Do you think that it is that people are stupid that they like fantasy better than science fiction?"
There is some of that in the industry. Yes, indeed.
So I feel like it may be that science fiction people feel that they must find a way to trick people to come to the thing that they truly love.
There might be some of that. All right. Quorum. Coolest award in fiction. It doesn't have to be just fantasy. Coolest award.
Coolest award. If you want to have one for your shelf for any reason, which is the one that is the coolest to have? Ooh. Is it like a Newbery or a Caldecott or something like that, just because we grew up reading them and that little stamp on the cover? Or is it like, for instance, I think my answer here is a Nebula. Because have you seen a Nebula award?
They're really cool.
They're so cool.
They are
Eric
really
has
pretty.
one, and they are so cool, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and isn't that the one in the TV show about the video game company? They had one character who was their writer. He had won a Nebula, and he carried it around with him to talk about how, when I won my Nebula, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. It is definitely the snootiest one also. What do you guys think?
I have a Nebula now because I had a Norton Award and then they made it into a Nebula.
They did make the Norton into a Nebula?
So my old Norton Award, which says Norton Award, is now a Nebula.
But they didn't send you a new cool looking thing?
My thing was cool though.
Yeah?
It is cool.
Okay.
It was as cool. Isn't there a horror one with a house though?
There is.
The
Stoker is a house.
The Stoker looks rad.
The Stoker
that
is a
beautiful.
very cool award. Yeah.
I really like that.
Dan, coolest award, just sheer coolness factor.
I probably am going to say the Stoker.
Okay.
Because I've always wanted one of those neat little haunted houses.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a neat looking thing.
Now, the Gimli was a battle axe when they had the Gimli.
Mm-hmm.
I got 2 of those. Well, one real one, and then I was like nominated twice, so they gave me a mini battle axe. So I got one of those. I lost to Sapkowski one year. But so battle axe is cool, but they repurposed a bunch of his, like he'd done a reproduction of an axe from his thing, and they just had extras. And I think that's where the award came from. So I think that loses a few points when it's a repurposed.
I gotta say that I do love the kind of showcase nature of the Hugos, where it's different every year. And hey, this time we got this artist to do it, and it's the same basic shape, but cool and different in this new way. I like that.
That is cool.
That's fun.
That is definitely. I'm still gonna hold my Nebula fort down, but I think so. Stoker is your vote, and your vote is Hugo.
Stoker.
Stoker.
I'm also voting Stoker.
Also Stoker. Okay, so there we go. I'll just say I am one of those that's glad that the world fantasy changed.
Yeah.
For multiple reasons, but I also think that the old one just didn't look very cool. And there's also a host of other reasons. And plus, for those who don't know, it used to be a bust of Lovecraft. Like, I want the fantasy award to be have some nod toward epic fantasy. It's now a tree. It's a cool looking tree. So, good move. Good move on that one.
I think that's the one I most covet.
You covet that one?
I do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a snooty award too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, it may be more snooty than the Nebula. Which is super cool that it's, snooty. But
yeah, they're all kind of snooty.
They're all kind of snooty. It's awards.
Yeah.
So all right. Dan.
Yes.
Where's the best place to shelve horror in the modern bookstore?
In a modern bookstore?
Mm-hmm. Because there is no horror section.
There is no horror section. I kind of like having my horror shelved in general fiction.
Okay.
Because then I get to pretend that I'm better than you.
Right. Okay.
But then no one finds it is the problem.
Well, Stephen King gets found and he's there, right?
Well, yeah, but he's Stephen King.
He gets a table.
Yeah, he's just, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Best I don't know. What do you think? Where you own a
probably right?
Fantasy? Yeah. I mean, yes.
Should they go back?
I miss Borders because Borders had a real horror section. And I wish that big chains did that. A lot of indies do have a dedicated horror section, and that's fantastic.
I think it's coming back to. I see just a huge turn toward horror, and I think that probably will lead to bookstores having.
Well, and the problem with the way it is right now is horror does not have to be fantastical. The people who want to read horror are looking for a certain emotional experience, and whether it's a monster or a serial killer will often give them that same experience. And so those books kind of belonged together in a way. But this way helps discoverability. Like, I don't know. I should ask Charlene if she preferred, because the True Blood books were in the fantasy section. They're more detective than anything, but they didn't put them in mystery. They didn't put them in general fiction. They put them in fantasy.
Yeah.
In most bookstores.
That's part of that fascinating sort of urban fantasy divide.
Yeah.
Like the language just around urban fantasy splitting and being on one side, you're sort of, Charles DeLint, Terry Windling, fairy books. And on the other side being kind of detective books and that also had vampires.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And romance.
ACOTAR, right? Where does that belong? You're a fairy expert. That's fae. That's romance. That's epic fantasy. Right? Like, obviously, we don't have to decide where a genre is, but where's the best place to shelve that?
See, this is why I love French bookstores, because they have a genre called polar that includes horror and thriller all under one umbrella.
Oh.
And so, like, my serial killer books are often very hard to find because people don't know whether they should look in mystery or crime or fantasy or horror or what. And in a French bookstore, it's just, it's in the Polar section because it has all of this stuff all in one place. It's really nice.
Well, and the dream is to be in all those sections,
yes.
right?
And you sometimes, if you're big enough, I would be surprised if ACOTAR, which is A Court of Thorns and Roses, isn't shelved in multiple sections. I bet it is.
I feel like it moved into adult fantasy, I'm not entirely sure. I've seen it there more.
I'm going to have to go look and see because, I'm sure it was shelved in romance at first, right?
It was shelved in YA.
Was it shelved in YA? ACOTAR was?
It's a YA book.
Is ACOTAR? I thought only the other ones were YA.
No, they all are YA.
They're all YA?
Except for Crescent City.
Okay,
all began as YA. And I do think that they have moved.
Okay.
But I think it's still kind of nebulous because they're coming out of Bloomsbury's YA section.
Okay.
And I will give you this definition of YA.
Yes.
YA is whatever a YA publisher puts out because they are a different department and they have a different budget.
Yeah.
And a different sales team.
Well, in science fiction fantasies, honestly, that's what it is. Why was True Blood shelved where it was? I think it's because the editor was a fantasy editor it worked largely at a fantasy publisher. I don't know if they were branded. I think they might have been Ace, but I don't think they were branded Ace. They might have been branded a different one under the Random Penguin logo or whatever. But I know that the editor was in touch with that world, and so they got shelved there.
Well, and it can come down to the bookstore buyer as well. Because if the buyer for Barnes & Noble, the one who buys all the fantasy stuff, got to it first and said, oh, I want this in my section, then that's where it'll end up.
All right. To that other question about genres and things, should we move all books in the bookstore into the fantasy and science fiction section? Because we can justify a lot of things. Should we just
start
consume
relabeling everything?
Should we consume? Because we could consume a lot of genres and a lot of books. Because there's lots of ghosts going on. There's lots of, sort of potentially demonic possession going on, and even a lot of thrillers and things. And, you look at something like even the one with the big thriller that was so popular, the Da Vinci Code. And you're like, there might be some fantastic elements to this guy, this albino guy, and things like that. Like, I bet we could gobble up most of the fiction section.
There's no question we should keep as much out as possible.
We'll keep it out. We'll gatekeep it. But I want to bring Toni Morrison into fantasy.
I want Toni Morrison.
I want to shelve Beloved in fantasy.
Yeah. See, ghosts. They don't count.
They never count them.
They never count. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's hard to find something more fantastical, but no, none doesn't count. Doesn't count. 100 Years of Solitude. I mean, you can fly, but you can't be a fantasy book.
Well, I mean, there used to be a way, right? You used to be able to sell your way out of fantasy, right? I'm not sure that's true now, but I do think there was a tipping point where, you just got moved out.
That happened. So who was I talking to? I think it was one of Pratchett's U.S. publisher, where they're like, we're not allowed to do certain things because we're the fantasy publisher. With Pratchett, this was years ago, so I'm sure it's changed. But that the mainstream publisher had come and grabbed Pratchett because certain sales thresholds have been hit, and they're like, we don't get to publish Pratchett anymore. The mainstream now takes care of that. I've always appreciated Neil Stephenson. I remember reading an interview with him. It's now been a while, right? But it was early 2000s. And this was just after She Who Shall Not Be Named, who wrote the Harry Potter books, said after she had done a big editorial about how her books weren't fantasy. And it was around the same time that, there was this sense there's that slum of fantasy, right. But if you write good books, you don't end up there. And definitely Joe Rowling had that. Certain other authors had that. Good Kind is famous for his rant about that I think he later regretted. And things like that. I always appreciate Neil Stephenson when he got asked. And Neil Stephenson, if there's anybody who could sneak out of genre fiction, right? It would be him, and it'd be Ursula Le Guin, right? The literary fiction keeps trying to claim both of those, and both of them are like, no. And they said in an interview, like they asked him some snide question. He's like, I am proud to be a science fiction writer. It has a long and great tradition, and it's like, don't you say I'm not one just because you like my books. And Ursula would do some of the same things. So good props on them. I've always appreciated it, but it gets under my skin a little bit. This idea that as soon as something is quote unquote good, as soon as something they like it, they pull it out of where its roots were.
And then it doesn't count as science fiction anymore.
I don't even know if that's true now. I don't know. I feel like the way that people approach fantasy is really different. I think people have really grown up loving fantasy now in a way that makes them not see it in those terms. I mean, I think there's still people who do, but
Yeah.
I was, just thinking about how much we have such a different, like, in terms of people in their, like, 20s and 30s, just a different understanding of the language of fantasy and specifically high fantasy.
Yeah.
From Game of Thrones, from Lord of the Rings. It's just so much more mainstream.
I agree with you, though I don't think I think some of the journalists are last ones to there's still a snideness now and then.
Yeah.
That pops up much more rarely than it used to, but it still does now and then.
Yeah. I think gatekeeping like that will always be a thing. And,
Yeah.
You're right that it's people who've grown up and, people our age are now in charge of stuff and making these much more kind of inclusive decisions about where lines are and what's cool and what's real and what's good. But there will always be the elitists that come in and say, oh, well, this one is better because that makes me smarter.
And I'm sure it's more so if there is less of that being reinforced, right? For the people who really feel it, they're going to feel it more deeply because they're not, it's no longer just a given, right? They really have to fight their corner.
All right.
Snooty corner.
Most important question of the night.
Okay.
Was it appropriate for Gimli to pledge his axe to Frodo after just having destroyed same said axe, trying to destroy the One Ring? He no longer has an axe to pledge to Frodo to take him to Mordor. Come on, Gimli. What's going on, man?
I mean, he did have a throwing axe on his belt, so he may have been pledging that one.
It was the axe in his heart.
It's the axe.
One of my favorite Reddit conversations that I've ever seen. Somebody was talking about Gimli and said, we need to give him props because everyone in that council in Rivendell was tempted by the ring, except Gimli, who stood up first thing and tried to destroy it. No moment of temptation. And somebody said, well, and I'm going to try to get through this without laughing. Somebody said, the ring shows you the thing you most desire. And the thing Gimli most desired was to not look like a little bitch in front of the elves.
Well done. Well done,
So,
anonymous
yeah.
Redditor. Yes. Though I can't still get out of my head the image of Frodo floating up the mountain because Sam is his imaginary friend from the last episode.
He was walking up. It was a very Fight Club style thing. He's just imagining Sam carrying him.
And then he left him behind to go with the elves? Damn.
He grew beyond his imaginary friend.
I'm sorry for this episode. It's Ben's fault.
This is my fault. I don't even sure how.